was never meant to feel like a church. There were no crosses, no saints, no prayers whispered in the language of forgiveness, only stone. Cold, ancient stone walls of Wewelsburg Castle rose into darkness, swallowing the flickering light of torches, placed with deliberate precision. Shadows moved along the circular chamber, stretching and twisting like something alive. At the center of the room, a pattern carved into the floor, dark, geometric, almost hypnotic, pulled the eye inward. 12 shapes forming a circle. A symbol that looked older than the men standing around it, even if it wasn't. They stood in silence. Black uniforms, silver insignia, faces rigid, controlled. These were not soldiers waiting for orders, not tonight. This was something else. One by one, they stepped forward. No priest greeted them. No scripture was read. Instead, a different kind of ritual began. One built not on faith, but on power. A voice echoed through the chamber, calm, controlled, absolute, the voice of Heinrich Himmler. He did not speak of salvation. He spoke of destiny, of blood, of a future where the old world, its religions, its morals, its God, would be swept away and replaced with something stronger, something purer, something engineered. The men listened, because this was no longer just an organization. The Schutzstaffel, the SS, was becoming something far more dangerous. Not an army, not a political force, a belief system. Outside, Europe was already at war. Cities would burn. Millions would die. But inside these walls, another transformation was taking place. Quieter, more deliberate, and in many ways, more disturbing. They weren't just fighting for territory, and they were rewriting meaning itself, redefining who deserved to live and who didn't. And to do that, they needed more than weapons. They needed faith. So they set out to build one. A faith without mercy, a faith without doubt, a faith with no God at all. Because what happens when a regime decides religion is not enough and tries to replace God? Long before the rituals, before the symbols carved into stone floors and ceremonies lit by fire, there was a problem. At least that's how Heinrich Himmler saw it. Germany, in the early 1930s, was still overwhelmingly Christian. Millions identified as Protestant or Catholic. Churches stood at the center of communities. Priests and pastors shaped moral life. Even after Adolf Hitler rose to power in January 1933, the language of religion still dominated the private world of ordinary Germans. But for men like Himmler, that was exactly the issue. Because Christianity, at its core, taught something the Nazi worldview could not accept. It taught humility. It taught compassion. It taught that all human beings, regardless of origin, had value. And that idea, more than anything, stood in direct conflict with what the SS was becoming. Himmler was not just building an elite military force. He was shaping an ideological order, one that demanded absolute loyalty, racial purity, and unquestioned obedience. In this world, strength was everything. Weakness was a flaw to be eliminated, and morality was something to be rewritten. Christianity, with its emphasis on forgiveness and mercy, looked dangerously incompatible. Even worse, it was universal. It didn't belong to one nation, one race, or one people. Its origins were Middle Eastern. Its central figure, Jesus, was not Aryan in any sense the Nazis wanted to accept. For a regime obsessed with ancestry and bloodlines, this posed a profound contradiction. How could they build a racial empire, while millions still followed a religion that preached equality? Himmler's answer was simple: they couldn't. So something had to change. At first, the approach was cautious. The Nazi leadership understood that openly attacking Christianity could destabilize society. Churches still held influence. Many Germans saw their faith as inseparable from their identity. So instead of direct confrontation, the regime began a slower, more calculated process. They reshaped the narrative. Christian language was twisted, reinterpreted, and gradually replaced. Some tried to create a Nazified version of Christianity, one stripped of its Jewish roots and reimagined to fit racial ideology. But for Himmler, even that wasn't enough. He didn't want to reform religion. He wanted to replace it. Unlike Hitler, who often used religion pragmatically as a political tool, Himmler was deeply invested in creating something new, something that felt ancient, powerful, and rooted in what he imagined as a lost Germanic past. He believed that before Christianity, the Germanic peoples had possessed their own spiritual system, a world of myths, warriors, ancestral pride, and sacred bloodlines. A world that, in his view, had been erased, suppressed by centuries of foreign religious influence. And he wanted to bring it back, or at least something that looked like it. By the mid-1930s, Himmler had begun to transform the SS into more than just an organization. It was becoming an order, not unlike a medieval knightly brotherhood, but with a modern, ideological core. Membership wasn't just about ability, it was about belief. SS officers were expected to see themselves as part of a racial elite. Their lineage was scrutinized, often traced back generations to prove purity. Their loyalty was not just to the state, but to an idea of destiny, a future where they would shape the world according to a new set of principles. Principles that had no room for traditional religion. Step by step, Christian practices were pushed aside within the SS. Religious ceremonies were discouraged. Clergy were excluded from influence. Instead, new forms of symbolic behavior began to appear. Rituals that emphasized unity, hierarchy, and myth rather than faith in a higher power. It was subtle at first, but it was intentional. Himmler understood something fundamental about human nature. People don't simply abandon belief. If you take something away, especially something as deeply rooted as religion, you have to replace it with something else. Something that fulfills the same psychological need: identity, purpose, meaning. The SS would provide all three. And to make that transformation complete, it wasn't enough to issue orders or write policies. It had to feel real, tangible, almost sacred. That's where ritual would come in. Because rituals do something ideology alone cannot. They create experience. They turn abstract ideas into lived moments. They bind individuals into a shared identity. They blur the line between belief and reality. Himmler knew that if the SS was to become more than an elite force, if it was to become a true order, it needed its own traditions, its own ceremonies, its own sense of the sacred, not borrowed from Christianity, but built to replace it. By the late 1930s, this vision was no longer theoretical. It was being constructed, carefully, deliberately, in a place far removed from the public eye. A place that would become the spiritual center of the SS. A place where ideology would take physical form. Where stone, symbol, and ritual would merge into something entirely new. That place was Wewelsburg Castle. And inside its walls, the transformation of the SS from organization to belief system was about to become real. It didn't look like the center of a new religion, at least, not at first. Perched on a triangular hill in the quiet region of Westphalia, Wewelsburg Castle had stood for centuries, built in the early 17th century as a Renaissance fortress, surrounded by forests, fields, and silence. There was nothing mystical about it, no ancient legends tying it to forgotten gods, no sacred history that would justify what it was about to become. And yet, in 1934, Heinrich Himmler saw something others didn't. Or perhaps he saw what he wanted to see. By that time, Himmler was already deep into his project of reshaping the SS into something more than a military force. He needed a center, a physical space that could anchor his vision, a place that felt removed from ordinary Germany, a place where the rules could be rewritten. Wewelsburg was perfect, isolated, imposing, and, most importantly, malleable. In 1934, Himmler leased the castle, and almost immediately, plans began to transform it. Not into a headquarters in the traditional sense, but into something far more symbolic. Something closer to a sanctuary, or a shrine. Officially, the castle was to serve as a training and meeting center for SS officers. But the scale and nature of the renovations suggested something else entirely. This wasn't just about administration. It was about meaning. Architects, designers, and planners were brought in under Himmler's direct supervision. The renovations were not random. Every room, every hall, every symbol had to serve a purpose. And that purpose was ideological. The SS was not just to be housed here. It was to be elevated. At the heart of the transformation stood the North Tower, the most important part of the castle. Himmler envisioned it as the spiritual core of the SS, a place reserved for the highest-ranking officers, a place where the future of the order would be shaped, not just politically, but symbolically. Inside the tower, a circular chamber was constructed, the Obergruppenführersaal. 12 columns lined the walls, 12 seats arranged in a ring, 12 high-ranking SS leaders gathered around a central space that seemed to pull everything inward. The number was not accidental. 12 evoked order, structure, a closed circle of power. It echoed traditions older than the SS itself, knightly orders, mythic councils, even religious symbolism. But here, stripped of context and reshaped, it became something else, something colder, something controlled. The room was designed to feel heavy, intentional, almost ritualistic, and beneath it, another chamber, darker, more unsettling, the crypt. Circular like the room above, but lower, enclosed, with thick walls that trapped both sound and light. At its center stood a stone feature, often described as an eternal flame holder, though its exact purpose remains debated. What mattered was not what it was, but what it felt like. This was not a place for meetings. This was a place for ceremony, for symbolism, for something that resembled reverence. Then there was the floor. In the upper chamber, set into the stone, a dark green mosaic formed a radial pattern, 12 sig-like shapes extending outward from a central circle. Today, it is often referred to as the Black Sun. There is no clear evidence that the SS themselves used that exact term. But the symbol, whether named or not, was undeniably deliberate. It drew the eye inward. It created focus. It suggested motion, energy, something radiating from the center. And most importantly, it replaced something. There was no altar, no cross, no sacred text, just a symbol, a constructed symbol placed exactly where something sacred might otherwise stand. Himmler's vision was becoming visible, but Wewelsburg was never meant to be public. This wasn't propaganda. This wasn't for the German people. This was for the inner circle, the elite, the SS leadership who were expected not just to command, but to believe. And belief required more than ideas. It required immersion. As the renovations continued, the castle expanded beyond just symbolic rooms. Plans were drawn up to transform the entire surrounding area into a vast SS complex, a kind of ideological capital. Roads, buildings, and structures were envisioned to radiate outward from the castle, turning it into the center of something much larger. A world built around a single idea, a single order, a single vision of the future. But even as construction progressed, something else was happening inside those walls. Gatherings, private meetings, ceremonies that were never fully documented, never openly described. Fragments remain, references in documents, architectural clues, testimonies after the war, but the full picture is incomplete. And maybe that was intentional, because what mattered wasn't just what happened there. It was how it felt to be there, to walk into a room where everything, from the shape of the space to the placement of symbols, was designed to influence you, to remind you that you were part of something larger, something chosen, something elevated. Wewelsburg was not ancient, but it was designed to feel timeless. It had no true spiritual history, but it was built to create one. And within its walls, the SS began to experiment with something dangerous, not just controlling people, but reshaping belief itself. Because once you build the temple, the rituals are not far behind. A temple means nothing without ritual. Stone walls, symbols, and silence can create atmosphere, but they do not create belief. Not on their own. For that, something more is required. Repetition, ceremony, experience. Inside Wewelsburg Castle, that process had already begun. There are no complete records of every ritual that took place there. No detailed scripts, no official manuals describing each movement, each word, each moment. Much of what we know comes from fragments, architectural design, scattered documents, testimonies, and the broader practices of the SS. But those fragments tell us enough to understand the intention. Because what Himmler was building was not random. It was structured, deliberate, and above all, psychological. At the center of it all stood Heinrich Himmler, a man who believed that symbols and ceremonies could shape reality. That if repeated often enough, performed with enough precision, ritual could transform not just behavior, but identity. He didn't need magic. He needed belief, and belief could be engineered. SS ceremonies were designed to feel different from anything familiar. They were stripped of traditional religious language but filled with structure. Silence played a role. So did lighting, space, positioning. Every element contributed to the same goal: to create a controlled emotional environment, one where the individual dissolved into the collective, one where doubt became difficult, one where participation felt like initiation into something exclusive. In the Obergruppenführer Saal, the circular chamber in the North Tower, not hierarchy was physically embedded into the space. 12 positions, 12 men, each one aware not only of his own place, but of everyone else's. No one stood above the circle, but no one stood outside it either. That was the point. The circle created equality within the elite, and separation from everyone else. Inside, you belonged. Outside, you did not. This is how cult structures often begin, not with coercion, but with inclusion. Rituals reinforce that feeling. SS officers participated in ceremonies marking key moments, promotions, appointments, and symbolic transitions within the organization. These were not casual events. They were carefully staged experiences, often incorporating elements that echoed older traditions: torches, oaths, formal gestures, while removing any reference to Christianity. No crosses, no priests, no prayers to a higher power. Instead, the focus shifted inward, to the order, to the idea of destiny, to the belief that the SS itself represented something greater than any individual. Oaths were central. Every SS member swore an oath of loyalty, not to a constitution, not to a nation in abstract terms, but directly to Adolf Hitler. This was not unusual in authoritarian systems, but within the SS, it carried additional weight. It was treated almost as a sacred bond, a commitment that went beyond duty, something closer to devotion. And like all powerful rituals, it wasn't just about the words. It was about the setting. Imagine standing in a dimly lit chamber, surrounded by men dressed identically, all focused, all silent, all participating in the same act. The architecture reinforces the moment. The symbolism suggests importance. The isolation removes distraction. In that environment, the line between performance and belief begins to blur. What starts as participation becomes internalization. That was the goal. Rituals also extended beyond Wewelsburg. Across the SS, symbolic ceremonies marked life events: birth, marriage, death, gradually replacing traditional religious practices with alternatives aligned to the ideology of the Reich. Naming ceremonies for children emphasized lineage and racial identity rather than spiritual blessing. Marriages were approved not by clergy, but by SS authorities, with the focus placed on ancestry and purity. Even seasonal celebrations were reshaped, drawing on reconstructed or invented Germanic traditions meant to evoke a sense of ancient continuity. But Wewelsburg remained different. It was not for the masses. It was for the core, for the leadership who would carry these ideas outward. And within its walls, the rituals took on a more concentrated form, less frequent, more controlled, more symbolic. Some historians suggest that certain ceremonies may have been tied to specific dates, anniversaries, solstices, or significant moments within the SS calendar. Others point to the design of the crypt beneath the main chamber as evidence of ritual use, possibly involving fire or symbolic offerings. But what's important is not the exact script, it's the intention behind it. Himmler understood that ritual creates memory, and memory creates identity. If an SS officer experienced enough of these moments, enough ceremonies reinforcing the same ideas, the same hierarchy, the same sense of belonging, he would begin to see himself differently. Not as a soldier, but as part of an order with its own rules, its own structure, its own meaning. And once that shift happened, control became easier. Because belief is stronger than instruction. A soldier follows orders. A believer defends them. And this is where the transformation of the SS becomes clear. It was never just about discipline. It was about conversion, turning individuals into something more predictable, more committed, more willing to act without hesitation. Rituals did not create that overnight. But they reinforced it, again and again, until it felt natural, until it felt necessary, until it felt right. And in that process, something subtle but critical was happening. The source of authority was changing, no longer rooted in tradition, no longer tied to religion. Instead, it was being relocated into the organization, into its symbols, into its rituals. The SS was no longer just enforcing ideology. It was embodying it. And once an institution becomes the source of meaning, it doesn't need a god anymore, because it has already taken his place. Every religion has its laws. Some are written in scripture, others are passed down through tradition. But all of them draw a line between what is accepted and what is not. For the SS, that line was drawn in blood, not metaphorically, literally. By the mid-1930s, under the direction of Heinrich Himmler, the idea of purity had moved far beyond ideology. It was no longer just a belief, it was a system, a structure, a set of rules that governed who could belong and who could never be allowed to. And like any system that claims absolute truth, it required proof, documentation, verification, control. To enter the SS was not simply to apply, it was to be examined. Candidates were required to submit detailed genealogical records, often tracing their ancestry back to at least 1750 for officers. Birth certificates, marriage records, church registries, every document had to align with one central idea, that the individual was of pure Aryan descent. This process was not symbolic. It was bureaucratic, systematic, and relentless. Entire departments were created to verify lineage. Experts reviewed family trees, searching for any sign of undesirable ancestry. A single inconsistency could disqualify a candidate. A distant relative, an unverified record, a question left unanswered. Belonging to the SS was not just about who you were. It was about who your ancestors had been. Because in Himmler's vision, blood was not just biology, it was destiny. This belief transformed the SS into something more than an elite organization. It became a gatekeeper, a filter through which only the chosen could pass. And once inside, that identity had to be preserved, protected, reinforced. That's where control expanded beyond recruitment and into life itself. Marriage, for example, was no longer a private matter. It was regulated. SS members were required to seek approval before marrying. Their partners underwent the same scrutiny. Ancestry checked, background investigated, suitability evaluated. Love in this system was secondary. What mattered was compatibility of blood. The union was not just between two individuals. It was between two lineages. A calculated step toward what the regime defined as a stronger future. This was not framed as oppression. It was presented as duty. A responsibility to the Reich, to the order, to the idea that the SS was not just shaping the present, but engineering what came next. And nowhere was that ambition more visible than in the program known as Lebensborn program. Established in 1935, Lebensborn was officially described as a welfare initiative, supporting mothers and children. But its deeper purpose was far more specific. It was about reproduction, selective reproduction. Then the program encouraged SS members and racially approved women to have children, often outside traditional marriage structures. Facilities were established where births could take place discreetly. The children would then be raised within a controlled environment, shaped by the ideology from the very beginning. This was not just policy. It was ritualized intention. The act of bringing a child into the world was no longer simply biological. It was ideological, a contribution to the future, a step toward building what the regime imagined as a perfect population. Even the language reflected this shift. Children were not just sons and daughters. They were carriers of blood, continuations of lineage, investments in a long-term vision. And like all systems built on control, it extended further. The children deemed racially suitable in occupied territories were sometimes taken from their families and integrated into German society, stripped of their original identities, reclassified, and raised according to SS ideals. Identity itself became flexible, redefined not by origin, but by usefulness. The logic was consistent, even if the consequences were not. If blood defined value, then everything else could be adjusted, rewritten, erased. Within this framework, morality was no longer external. There was no higher authority, no divine law, no universal principle, only the system, only the rules defined by the SS. And those rules were clear. Purity must be maintained. Strength must be preserved. Anything that threatened either had to be removed. This is where ideology and control became indistinguishable. Because once belief is tied to biology, it stops being abstract. It becomes measurable, enforceable, and, ultimately, actionable. The SS did not need traditional religion to define right and wrong. It had already replaced it, with a system that claimed to be just as absolute, just as unquestionable, just as final. But instead of salvation, it offered selection. Instead of forgiveness, it enforced exclusion. And instead of a soul, it measured blood. Because in this new order, purity wasn't a metaphor. It was the law. And everything else was expendable. In most societies, marriage is more than a legal act. It is a ritual, a moment where two people stand before something greater than themselves, before family, tradition, often before God, and make a promise that is meant to last beyond a lifetime. But in the world of the SS, even that had to change. Because if you are building a new belief system, you cannot allow the most important rituals of life to belong to the old one. Under the direction of Heinrich Himmler, marriage was no longer just personal. It became political, biological, ideological. Before an SS officer could marry, he needed permission, not from a priest, not from his family, from the SS itself. The process was meticulous. Applications were submitted, documents reviewed, backgrounds investigated. The prospective bride underwent the same scrutiny as the officer, her ancestry traced, her lineage examined, her suitability evaluated according to the racial standards of the regime. This was not a suggestion. It was a requirement. Because in this system, marriage was not about love. It was about continuity. Two individuals were not simply forming a partnership. They were combining bloodlines. And that combination had to meet the criteria set by the order. Only then could the ceremony take place. And when it did, it looked very different. Traditional church weddings were discouraged within SS circles. Instead, alternative ceremonies were introduced, events that borrowed the structure of ritual but removed its religious core. No altar, no priest, no mention of God. In place of these elements came something else: symbols, oaths, authority rooted in the state rather than the sacred. In some ceremonies, SS officers would stand in uniform, and their presence alone reinforcing the connection between the couple and the order. The atmosphere was formal, controlled, deliberate. Every gesture carried meaning, not spiritual, but ideological. The vows were not directed upward. They were directed inward, toward the Reich, toward the future, toward the idea that this union was part of something larger than personal happiness. In certain cases, ceremonies incorporated symbolic objects, candles, runic imagery, or artifacts tied to what Himmler imagined as ancient Germanic tradition. These elements were not historically authentic in any consistent way. Many were reconstructed, adapted, or entirely invented. But authenticity was not the goal. Effect was. The ceremony needed to feel different, to create a sense of separation from the past, to signal that this was not just another wedding. It was a transformation, a transition into a new kind of life. Even the timing of marriages could carry symbolic weight. Some were aligned with dates considered significant within the SS calendar, reinforcing the idea that personal milestones should be integrated into the rhythm of the order. Everything pointed in the same direction, away from the individual, toward the system. And the message was clear. Your marriage does not belong to you. It belongs to the future we are building. Gifts presented to SS couples often reflected this ideology. Items bearing runic symbols, references to ancestry, or inscriptions tied to SS identity replaced traditional religious artifacts. Even something as simple as a wedding ring could carry meaning beyond the personal, becoming a marker of belonging to a specific worldview. One of the most symbolic objects associated with SS marriages was the so-called SS honor ring, awarded to certain members as a sign of loyalty and status. While not exclusively tied to weddings, it reinforced the idea that personal identity and organizational identity were inseparable. You were not just a husband, you were an SS man first, and your family was an extension of that role. This transformation had consequences, because when marriage is removed from its traditional framework, something else must take its place. In Christianity, marriage is often seen as sacred, a bond witnessed and blessed by a higher power. It carries moral weight beyond the individuals involved. But within the SS, that higher authority was gone. There was no divine witness, no external standard, only the order, only its rules, only its approval. This shifted the meaning of commitment. It was no longer anchored in faith. It was anchored in function. What mattered was not the promise itself, but what that promise produced: children, lineage, continuation. And because of that, the boundaries of marriage became more flexible than they appeared. Programs like Lebensborn program blurred the line between marriage and reproduction, encouraging births that aligned with ideological goals, even outside traditional family structures. Not the institution of marriage remained. But Its purpose had changed. It was no longer about union. It was about output. And like every other aspect of SS life, it was integrated into a larger system of control, a system that did not need religion, because it had already replaced its functions: guidance, approval, meaning. All of it now came from the same source, the same structure, the same authority. And in that world, standing before a priest and speaking vows to God would have felt unnecessary, because the SS had already positioned itself as something just as powerful, just as absolute, just as final, not a witness to marriage, but the force that defined it. Every belief system must answer one final question: what happens when you die? For centuries, Christianity had provided that answer: heaven, hell, judgment, salvation, a moral framework that extended beyond life itself, a promise that what you did mattered, even after you were gone. But within the SS, that promise was replaced, not with something clearer, but with something colder, more controlled, more useful. Under the influence of Heinrich Himmler, death was not treated as an end, or even as a transition into a spiritual afterlife. It became something else entirely, a continuation of purpose, a reinforcement of identity, a final integration into the order. Traditional Christian funerals were discouraged among SS members. Priests were pushed aside, crosses disappeared. In their place came ceremonies that reflected the same principles seen in life: discipline, symbolism, and absolute alignment with ideology. The dead were not commended to God. They were honored as part of the SS funeral ceremonies emphasized service, loyalty, and sacrifice, not in a spiritual sense, but in a political one. Speeches focused on duty fulfilled, on the role the individual had played within the larger structure. The message was consistent. Your life had meaning because it served the Reich, and your death confirmed it. Symbolism played a central role. Instead of religious imagery, funerals often incorporated SS insignia, flags, all and carefully arranged visual elements designed to create a sense of order and permanence. The environment was controlled, just like in life. There was no uncertainty, no ambiguity, only structure. In some cases, torches were used during ceremonies, casting moving shadows that echoed the aesthetic of other SS rituals. Light and darkness were not just visual choices. They were emotional tools, shaping how the moment was experienced. Because even in death, perception mattered, and perception could be managed. The idea of an individual soul, something separate, something eternal, was not central to the system. Instead, emphasis shifted toward continuity of the collective. The individual dissolved into the larger narrative of the SS. You did not ascend. You did not face judgment. You became part of something that continued. Memory replaced eternity. Legacy replaced salvation. And that legacy was defined not by personal virtue, but by alignment with the order. This shift had consequences, because when death is no longer tied to moral accountability beyond the system itself becomes the only reference point for meaning. There is no higher authority, no external standard, no final evaluation beyond what the organization defines. In that world, actions are judged not by universal principles, but by usefulness, by effectiveness, by whether they serve the intended outcome. This is where ideology becomes self-contained, closed, reinforcing. Nothing exists outside it, not even death. At places like Wewelsburg Castle, the architectural design itself hinted at this transformation. The crypt beneath the main ceremonial chamber, circular, enclosed, the heavy, has often been interpreted as a space intended for symbolic connection to the dead. There is no definitive evidence that it functioned as a burial site in the traditional sense. But that may not have been the point. Its presence alone suggests intention, a place where memory could be contained, where the idea of continuity, of an unbroken order extending beyond individual lives, could be reinforced through space, through design, through ritual. Above, the circular chamber for the living. Below, a space that implied something beneath, something enduring, something collective. This vertical arrangement was not accidental. It mirrored a structure found in many belief systems: an upper world, a lower space, a connection between them. But here, stripped of theology, it became something else: a framework without a soul, a system without transcendence. Because the SS did not offer an afterlife in the traditional sense. It offered absorption. To live was to serve. To die was to become part of the narrative that justified that service. And that narrative was controlled, carefully maintained, repeated, reinforced. This is how belief survives without religion, not through faith, but through structure, through ritual, through memory that is shaped, directed, and preserved. And in that system, death is not feared, not because of hope, but because of certainty. A certainty that your place, your role, your identity has already been defined. And once that definition is complete, there is nothing left to question, because the system has already answered for you, in life and in death. Rituals create emotion, but indoctrination makes it permanent. By the time an SS officer stood in a torchlit chamber or took part in a ceremony, something far more important had already happened. The groundwork was laid long before the ritual began. Because belief, real belief, doesn't start with symbols. It starts with repetition, with structure, with control over what a person sees, hears, and begins to accept as normal. Under Heinrich Himmler, the SS was designed to do exactly that. From the moment a recruit entered the organization, he was not just trained as a soldier. He was reshaped, slowly, systematically, without ever being told directly that this was the goal. Training in the SS combined physical discipline with ideological immersion. Recruits were taught history, but not as it was, rather as it was interpreted through the lens of the regime. They studied race theory, mythology, and narratives that reinforced a single idea: that they belonged to a superior group destined to lead. This wasn't presented as opinion. It was presented as fact. And when something is repeated often enough in a controlled environment, surrounded by authority figures who reinforce it, it begins to feel true. Isolation played a key role. SS members were encouraged to see themselves as separate from the rest of society. Not just better trained or more disciplined, but fundamentally different. A higher tier, an inner circle. This division created distance. And distance makes influence easier. Because once you stop identifying with the outside world, you stop questioning the system you're inside. You begin to trust it, depend on it, believe in it. Language reinforced that separation. The SS didn't just use standard military terminology. It developed its own vocabulary, phrases, titles, and concepts that carried specific meaning within the organization. Over time, this language shaped how members thought. Because language doesn't just describe reality, it defines it. If you call something duty often enough, it begins to feel necessary. If you call something purity, it begins to feel moral. If you call something threat, it begins to feel real. And once those ideas are embedded, behavior follows. Authority within the SS was also carefully structured. Loyalty was not abstract, it was personal. Every member swore allegiance directly to Adolf Hitler. This created a direct line between the individual and the highest level of power. There were no intermediaries, no competing sources of authority, just one center. And that clarity simplified decision-making. Because when authority is absolute, doubt becomes unnecessary. You don't weigh options, you follow. But indoctrination was not only about hierarchy, it was about identity. SS members were encouraged to see themselves as part of an order, something closer to a brotherhood than a military unit. Comparisons to medieval knightly orders were not accidental. Himmler actively promoted this imagery, drawing parallels between the SS and groups like the Teutonic Knights. The message was subtle but powerful. You are not just serving. You are continuing a legacy. You are part of something that existed before you and will continue after you. This sense of continuity gave meaning to individual actions. It connected personal choices to a larger narrative, and that narrative, once accepted, became difficult to question. Because to question it would be to question your place within it. And most people don't do that easily, especially when everything around them reinforces the same idea. Uniforms contributed to this effect. Then the black SS uniform was not just practical, it was symbolic. Clean lines, sharp contrasts, distinct insignia. It created a visual identity that separated SS members from everyone else. When you wear something that marks you as different, you begin to feel different. And when others respond to you as different, that feeling deepens. Over time, the external becomes internal. You stop playing the role. You become it. Social reinforcement strengthened the process. Promotion within the SS was not based solely on competence. It was also tied to ideological alignment. Those who demonstrated commitment to the worldview advanced. Those who didn't belong. This created a feedback loop. Belief led to recognition. Recognition reinforced belief. And slowly, the system filtered itself, leaving behind those who fit perfectly, and removing those who didn't. Rituals, when they came, were no longer strange. They felt natural, expected, even necessary. Because by that point, the individual had already been prepared, conditioned, aligned. This is how indoctrination works at its most effective. Not through force, but through environment, through consistency, through the gradual replacement of one framework with another, until the new system doesn't feel imposed. It feels obvious. It feels right. It feels true. And once that happens, control no longer requires constant enforcement. It becomes self-sustaining. Because believers don't need to be told what to do. They already know. They act not because they are ordered, but because they are convinced. And that is what made the SS different. It wasn't just an organization of disciplined soldiers. It was a structure that produced conviction, a system that turned ideology into identity, and identity into action. Because once a person no longer sees themselves as separate from the system, there is no longer a line between following it and becoming it. By the end of the war, the image was already forming. Black uniforms, secret rituals, ancient symbols carved into stone, a hidden order operating behind the visible machinery of the Third Reich. It felt like something out of a legend. And in many ways, that's exactly what it became. Because when the SS collapsed along with Nazi Germany in 1945, it didn't just leave behind documents and ruins. It left behind gaps, silences, unanswered questions. And into those gaps, stories began to grow. Some were based on truth. Others were built on imagination. The idea of the SS as an occult order, deeply involved in secret magic, hidden knowledge, and supernatural rituals, has persisted for decades. Books, films, and conspiracy theories have painted a picture of an organization obsessed with ancient powers, searching for mystical artifacts, performing ceremonies designed to tap into forces beyond the natural world. But how much of that is real? And how much of it is projection? The answer is complicated. There is no doubt that Heinrich Himmler had a genuine interest in mythology, the symbolism, and what he believed to be ancient Germanic traditions. He supported research into pre-Christian history. He funded expeditions. He encouraged the study of runes, folklore, and racial origins. Organizations like the Ahnenerbe were created to explore these ideas, though often with a clear ideological agenda rather than scientific rigor. But interest does not equal evidence of the supernatural, and that distinction matters. Because while the SS did engage in ritualized behavior, ceremonies, symbolic spaces, structured gatherings, there is little credible evidence to suggest that these rituals were intended to invoke actual mystical forces. They were not casting spells. They were creating meaning. What Himmler understood, whether consciously or intuitively, was that symbolism has power, not supernatural power, psychological power, but the ability to influence perception, to shape identity, to make something feel significant, even if it is entirely constructed. The rituals at places like Wewelsburg Castle were real. The architecture was intentional. The ceremonies, however partially documented, were designed to create a specific experience. But that experience was not about accessing another world. It was about controlling this one. Still, after the war, the myth expanded. Writers and filmmakers began to explore the more sensational aspects of the SS, often blurring the line between fact and fiction. The lack of complete records made it easy to fill in the gaps. The secrecy surrounding certain activities only added to the intrigue. And over time, the image of the SS shifted from a historical organization to something almost mythological, a dark order, a hidden cult, a force operating beyond ordinary understanding. But that transformation risks missing something more important. Because the reality, while less mysterious, is far more unsettling. The SS did not need supernatural beliefs to become what it was. It did not need hidden powers or ancient secrets. Everything it built, its rituals, its symbols, its systems, was human, designed, tested, refined. It functioned not because of magic, but because of structure, because of psychology, because of the ability to shape how people think, feel, and see themselves within a system. That is what made it effective, and that is what makes it dangerous to misunderstand. If we treat it as something mystical, something distant, something unreal, we risk turning it into a story, a legend, something that feels disconnected from reality. But it wasn't. It was deliberate, methodical, and entirely grounded in the real world. The symbols at Wewelsburg were not ancient relics discovered by chance. They were placed. The rituals were not inherited traditions. They were constructed. The belief system was not uncovered. It was built, piece by piece, with intention. And once complete, it didn't rely on secrecy or mystery to function. It relied on people, and on their willingness to accept a narrative, to participate in a system, to become part of something that felt meaningful, even if that meaning was defined for them. This is where myth becomes dangerous, because it shifts focus away from what actually matters, not whether the SS believed in the supernatural, but how they created a system that others believed in, a system that replaced traditional structures with its own, a system that answered questions people didn't even realize they were asking. Who are you? Where do you belong? What gives your life meaning? The SS provided answers, clear, absolute, and once accepted, difficult to escape. So the question is not whether the rituals were mystical, it's whether they worked. And in many ways, they did. Not because they revealed hidden truths, but because they replaced them. In the end, though it didn't collapse in silence, it ended in fire. By 1945, the world that Heinrich Himmler had tried to build was already falling apart. The war was lost. Cities lay in ruins. The system that had once claimed absolute control was breaking under pressure from every direction. And with it, the illusion began to crack. The SS, once presented as an elite order, a brotherhood, almost a new kind of faith, did not stand apart from that collapse. It dissolved with it. The rituals stopped. The ceremonies ended. The symbols that once carried meaning were reduced to fragments, etched into stone, scattered across abandoned spaces, like Wewelsburg Castle, where silence replaced the voices that once filled its halls. There was no final gathering, no closing rite, no moment of reflection. Because systems like this don't end with ceremony. They end with reality. As Allied forces advanced, the structures that had sustained the SS, its hierarchy, its control, its carefully constructed identity, began to disappear. Orders no longer carried the same weight. Authority fractured. The certainty that had once defined everything was gone. And without that certainty, belief had nothing to hold on to. Many SS members tried to escape. Some destroyed documents. Others denied involvement. Some continued to believe. But the system itself, the one that had defined meaning, this identity, purpose, was no longer there to reinforce those beliefs. And without reinforcement, even the strongest narratives begin to weaken. That is the fragility of constructed faith. It depends on structure, on repetition, on control. Remove those elements, and it begins to unravel. Himmler himself never saw the end of what he had built. In May 1945, after being captured, he took his own life. There was no ritual, no ceremony, no symbolic closure, just a single act carried out in isolation. A quiet end to a man who had tried to create something absolute and failed. Because in the end, the SS never became what it was trying to be. It was not a true religion. It had no transcendence, no enduring belief beyond the system that enforced it. It did not survive its own collapse. And that is what separates it from the religions it tried to replace. Christianity had endured centuries. Empires had risen and fallen around it. But it remained. The SS, by contrast, existed for barely more than a decade in its fully developed form. And when the power behind it disappeared, so did the belief. Because it was never truly independent. It did not grow organically. It was imposed, engineered, maintained through control rather than conviction. And once that control was gone, there was nothing left to sustain it. Today, the remnants remain. Symbols carved into floors, documents preserved in archives, buildings that still stand, stripped of their original purpose. They are studied, analyzed, remembered, not as sacred places, but as warnings, because what the SS attempted was not unique in its ambition. The idea of replacing belief with ideology, of reshaping identity through structure and ritual, has appeared in different forms throughout history. And it will appear again. The details will change. The symbols will be different. But the mechanism remains the same. Create meaning, control identity, replace the old with something new, and present it as inevitable, as necessary, as truth. That is how systems like this begin, not with force, but with belief. And that is why understanding what happened inside places like Wewelsburg matters. Not because of mystery, not because of myth, but because of how real it was, how deliberate, how human. Because they didn't just try to control people. They tried to control what people believed. And for a time, they almost succeeded. But in the end, the system collapsed. The ritual stopped. The faith disappeared. And what remained was not a new religion, but a lesson, one written not in scripture, but in history.